Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. It's good to be with you again this week. Listeners, I apologize. It's been several weeks since our last episode. As you may imagine, summertime in election years is really busy, really hectic. I have made outlines for episodes several times since our last one, which was published on August 16th. And that was the day that State Superintendent Ryan Walters held that late Friday afternoon press conference at the Capitol where he challenged the legislature to go ahead and impeach him. He called for his own impeachment, which to my knowledge is unprecedented. Obviously, they did not. We would have definitely done a special episode if they had actually impeached him. They have not. They saw through that as a PR ploy. And really, it's been relatively quiet up there. Shortly thereafter, there's some investigations happening in the background or starting to happen. There's been a bunch of hullabaloo about American flags up in Edmond schools. But I think more importantly, school districts across the state have now returned to the classroom. School is back in session, both Common Ed and Higher Ed. And that means that presumably Superintendent Walters and his staff are actually focused on doing the work. We'll find out if that's true, I imagine, over the next few months. Also, since our last episode, we had an election. We had the primary runoff, or it's mostly a primary runoff. Of course, there were other issues on the ballot. That was on August 27th. And it was notable in a few ways, right? Some races to highlight. In Tulsa, the race for mayor was narrowed, right? This was the initial election for mayor. Tulsa does theirs a little bit differently by doing them on even-numbered years for elections. And so this was essentially the primary ballot for their mayor. It's a nonpartisan race. They had, 8 or 9 candidates, and it narrowed down to just 2, sitting County Commissioner Karen Keith and State House Member Monroe Nichols are the top 2 finishers. So in Oklahoma, our municipal elections are a open primary top 2. It's a nonpartisan race. The top 2 vote getters move on to the general. So it'll be Nichols and Keith. And there's been some internal party shenanigans dealing with that, but we're nonpartisan. We're not going to get into that. I encourage you to go to Read Non-Doc or Oklahoma Voice or Oklahoma Watch, one of our excellent nonprofit news outlets. The other ones are good too. Oklahoma and Tulsa World, that's all relevant as well. I'm just partial to the non-profit ones because they're doing the work, not under the thumb of the man. Also in that election in August, some pretty major upsets. Yet again, we saw some, we'll say, establishment Republicans, people like Blake Cowboy Stevens and House Appropriations Chairman Kevin Wallace both lost. The fact that they even had to go to a runoff was a bit of a red flag. It means they didn't win their primary outright. So someone from their own party was challenging them. It went to a runoff because there were multiple challengers, and that meant that they had to, that neither one of them or any of the others got a majority. So they had to have this runoff, and they lost. Many of these races were exceedingly close, like just a handful of votes. But here again, we've seen, I think, almost wholesale change in the legislative leadership in both chambers, right? We've got Speaker McCall, Floor Leader Eccles, though they both termed out. Kevin Wallace, now the A&B chair, ousted. Several people, McIntyre, others that I think weren't seeking re-election. Over in the Senate, Pro Tem Greg Treat termed out. The incoming Pro Tem elect, Greg McCartney, lost his primary, so now he's out as well. Roger Thompson is out, who was the A&B chair over there. Just a lot of pretty substantial change. And so any of you listeners who have been following the legislature since 2016, 2017, 2018, it's a whole new class of folks up there, which is, some would say is good. People would be like, yeah, vote those bums out. Well, again, we don't vote anybody out. We only vote for other people. And the fact that these folks aren't there means that the legislature has lost a lot of institutional knowledge, like a lot of people who knew how to govern are out, and new people are coming in. And some of them might know how to govern, some of them might not. We really don't know yet. They haven't even been sworn in. They haven't. Some of them still have, maybe a general election to go, but it's going to be a whole new vibe at the state capitol next year. And I think a lot of people from all parties are getting nervous, right? Because a lot of these people that have won are like hardline, far-right conservatives. We also, to that end, we just saw last week the Oklahoma Freedom Caucus announced their presence. There's been pieces of this in the past. This really was modeled after in Congress, the Freedom Caucus, which is like the far-right caucus group of lawmakers. They're establishing chapters in the states. Previously, like in 2018, there was this group in the legislature that called themselves the Platform Caucus that was essentially the same as the Freedom Caucus, just a different name. Again, it was the far-right folks. And ironically, many of them lost their re-elections in 2018 to more moderate Republicans because there was a bit of an insurgency run by some establishment Republicans in the House. Chris Kennedy and some others kind of led this with the explicit goal of ousting this far right because they had become ungovernable, right? And when you look at the legislature, what ends up happening now is that you almost have three parties. You've got the Democrats that are, a small 15, 20% of a chamber. Then you've got the Republicans are the rest, but the Republicans have this fracture between what I'm calling the establishment Republicans and the far-right Freedom Caucus members. And I don't really know yet exactly what that breakdown looks like or how they're going to govern. I know what happened in 2018 was that in some cases you had the far-right and the Democrats aligned on some issues, maybe around tax policy. They might both be opposed to a bill, but for different reasons, right? Kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. It's really hard to know what's going to happen now. But I think as we see more of these folks moving into the legislature, it also means that there's been change, not just in the makeup of the legislature, but makeup of the leadership of who's there, who are going to be the committee chairs, the subcommittee chairs, all of the deputies and the leaders and all that stuff. So, man, I don't know. The number of scraps of paper on my desk with little notes about people has really piled up.
I think it'll change a lot I think a big thing that people might not think about is the relationships that they have within each other, like within their own party. I feel like that's going to really, anytime there's anybody new that's getting thrown in there, it'll have a little bit of a dynamic change. So we'll have to see what that looks like.
That's very true. And Ava, thanks for jumping in. Joining me today, I have two special guests. One is a friend of the pod, a previous guest host, our fellow Ava Woodall. Hello, Ava. Welcome back to the show.
Good afternoon.
We are also joined by our new intern who's interning with us this semester, Preston Salameh.
Hi,
Hello.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Preston, if you listen to the podcast and you get our emails, you will have undoubtedly by now seen an email from him coming out this week. We're really excited to have him this semester. And maybe, Preston, we'll talk a little bit about you first, as we often do with our interns and fellows here.
Intro.
Yeah. Tell us about yourself, where you go to school, what you're studying, all that jazz.
Well, like Andy said, my name's Preston. I go to the University of Oklahoma right now. I'm studying political science and economics. I'm hoping to go to law school one day, but just right now I'm interning with Andy here, and I've been here since the beginning of the school year. And it's been a blast so far. So,
you don't have to give
here.
praise. We accept that, but it's,
no.
It's not like our listeners donate on how much praise I get. Although if you'd like to donate, please, letsfixthis.org/donate.
Yeah.
Well, I invited Ava and Preston to join me today. One, so you don't just have to listen to me for 30 or 40 minutes, but secondly, because we have the opportunity, right, to hear from America's youth. There's a lot of conversation about what Gen Z is doing this election. A big chunk of Gen Z wasn't able to vote in the last presidential election, which I think is the case for both of you, right? You were
Yeah,
We're-
this will be my first presidential. Yeah.
election, and same for you, because
Yeah, my first presidential election.
and so what an election to make your debut. And so I want to talk a little bit about your perspective as individuals. Certainly, we recognize that you do not speak for your entire generation. Gen Z is not a monolith, but for lack of a proper focus group, we have you, and we're going to talk about what you see, what your friends talk about, what's what are the issues kind of shaping your approach to things this year. And Ava, I'll start with you. You are 19, right? So very still new into the electoral world, although as listeners know, you've been around politics for most of your life. How, for you as a 19-year-old woman facing this election, what are the issues that you care about, you worry about, you think about? What are the things that are kind of affecting your perspective on voting?
I think that, well, oh my goodness, where do I start? Of course, abortion is a thing that, touches me deeply, that I have a lot of concern about, that is either overlooked or dismissed, as everybody knows. A very controversial topic, unfortunately. Oh gosh. Setting up our economy to have a stable future. I mean, I feel like that's something, at least for me personally, I think about a lot, is what our future at least looks like, because I feel like it's so much different. Every generation has different experiences, and they, all go through awful things. History is history. That is fine. But
I don't think you often hear 19-year-olds say, "I'm concerned about economic futures for myself." That terminology is a little bit different, but but you really do. I mean, on other podcasts I listen to, or news coverage that I read, that issue is coming up because we've gone through a period, right? Like you were entering adulthood at a period of somewhat economic
we're not
uncertainty.
stable. We don't feel stable, at least. I try to have lots of conversations with my peers and, people around my age, or people that I've gone to school with for a while, and try to have active conversations about, I'm like, am I crazy? Is this, am I the only one that feels like this? But it is a very mutual feeling that we all have been experiencing.
When you say economy, what does that mean to you? Are you thinking about job prospects, or inflation, or housing costs, or food costs, or
all of that? I think mainly right now, especially for at least, I guess, 19-year-olds as of now, housing is a really big thought that floats around in my head a lot. Me and my best friend, we both, are 19. We both live at home. We both, have jobs where we would try to work ourselves pretty good. And the thought of living in at least an apartment independently by ourselves, or even together, just thinking about that and all the expenses, and it just seems a little bit more difficult and a lot more of a challenge. And it's something that I wish that could feel more doable, at least for me. But it's just not something in the cards anytime soon. I mean, it's difficult to be financially stable and be independent like that at a young age, at least today.
Right. So housing costs being, even for rental, is there's a lot of coverage given to mortgage rates right now, especially with the Fed meeting this month. But on a very personal level, right? Just the amount of money it would cost to rent an apartment with your best friend.
That isn't cheap. It's not cheap. I mean, the price gouging with food, in groceries, and just paying, oh my goodness, basic expenses are just so inflated that it is hard to, it stresses me out just thinking about it. And these are not responsibilities that I obviously have started, now. So I just, many things to think about.
Yeah, for sure. Preston, what about you? What are the main issues that you think about with this election?
Yeah, I don't know how accurate of a representation I am of my population, but I will say climate change has always been a big thing to me. Healthcare, education, those are probably my big three. I will say when I talk to my friends and people my age, of course, like we just talked about, the economy is going to come up. Immigration is another big one. And I feel like that's one thing that's kind of struck me recently is I feel like a lot of the times political parties almost like define themselves as they're the one party that can solve this issue. And it's interesting to me because, I mean, I think we all know that's not the case. And I think we know that, like, you would hope to see more Democrats maybe talking about immigration. You would hope to see more Republicans maybe talking about healthcare. I think we don't need to limit, our party system doesn't need to limit itself to, this party cares about these issues and this party cares about these issues. No, at the end of the day, I think we all kind of care about the same goal. It's just the approach we have to getting there. And I think as a young person, it's kind of disheartening to see these certain issues only being represented in one specific party.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's really interesting. I'm thinking back to so we're recording this on Tuesday, which is unusual for us to early in the week, and we did that because tonight is the presidential debate, and I want to leave opportunity for a reaction pod later in the week.
Yeah.
But I can think back to, presidential or other candidate debates in the past where there's a certain issue and the policy discussion is around how would I approach solving this problem, and the other person might have a different approach to solving it. And I think it seems to me like in today's political climate, even getting two candidates to agree that the same problem is a problem, right? Like often it's like, oh, well, that's not a problem. I want to talk about this other thing instead.
Exactly.
And that they end up taking it on in like completely different ways.
I mean, it's alienating as a constituent. Like, it creates more partisanship when that is not something that we need right now.
Right, yeah. Well, because it makes it tough to have an honest conversation with with someone who is ostensibly there to solve problems and create solutions to public policy issues if someone won't engage even in discussion about the issue. Yeah. Preston, you mentioned issues like climate change and immigration.
Yeah.
Are those issues that you were worried about because they affect you directly, or are you, like as Ava said earlier, thinking about not just what affects you right now, but what you need in the future or what society needs in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I will say it's probably more of a future-leaning view. Obviously, there are effects of climate change that we're feeling right now, but I think the worst is obviously yet to come. And just as a young person myself, I feel like, and I'll talk to plenty of people my age, and they also feel the same way, is that we're not treating this issue like it's going to be here in 50 years, like all of us are going to be here in 50 years. And maybe the people that are in charge right now aren't going to be here in 50 years, but there's a lot of us that are going to be here. Yeah. And we need to start being more proactive, I think, as a society. That's one thing we talk about, is being more proactive rather than reactive when it comes to these kinds of issues, and just looking forward and realizing that these problems are happening right now and they're going to get worse. So we might as well stop it now before it gets even worse. Yeah. I think is a big thing for young people.
That's tough because it seems, a lot of government is designed to be reactive, right? Like we don't always want government in the, big G word to like be the leader on some things. And I think historically the small c conservative approach to government, right, is to let government take a wait and see approach and I think AI is a good example of this right now, where we all know it's a big deal. We know it's going to have huge implications for society. We're not even sure what they are yet. The AI companies aren't even sure yet. And while some countries, mainly in Europe, are taking a more proactive approach to limiting scope, setting some guardrails, the U.S. is not. The U.S. is letting these companies have some runway to kind of see what happens, which inherently increases the risk, right? Of like, we'll let it go a little bit further and then we'll step in, and we all kind of hope like, well, I hope it's not too late by then. And the same thing with climate change, even with inflation, right? Ava, like the Fed's meeting this month, they've signaled that they're going to decrease rates, and now it's just a matter of like how much, 0.25%, 0.5%. But that is still a response to data that's already come out. So like based on what's happening, here's what we're going to do to kind of help keep it in the direction going. But it's not necessarily a strong, heavy-handed approach. And I would argue that Fed policy is probably the most proactive. It's really hard to anticipate, when a pandemic is going to happen or some of, when Lehman Brothers is going to crash seemingly
Yes.
overnight. Some of that stuff happens unexpectedly, but where they can, they really try to take a slow, long view of the economy.
Yeah, and that's one thing I will say about the Fed specifically is I think a lot of young people honestly are kind of tired of politicians pushing for policies that aren't necessarily thinking about the future, and I think that's because they have a current stake right now in like running for re-election and things like that. They're thinking about the short term and not the long term. Whereas the Fed and all these other independent agencies, I think that's where they really have a kind of advantage to think about like future long term policy that I think us young people kind of really appreciate. So I think when we kind of hear rhetoric about like stripping away some of the independent agencies, I think that kind of turns off a lot of young people just by signaling that, we're not going to think as long term as we used to, and now we're going to kind of think more in the short term.
We're literally rewinding time with policies like that.
Yeah.
Like that is something I feel like I talk about with my peers all the time, is that a lot of current office holders, unfortunately, are very selfish and think, what will get me to next re-election, or how can I benefit from this most, when the position that they were put in was to help and provide representation for their constituents.
Yeah.
And so, it's a major slap in the face when you see somebody that represents a district that you reside in, misusing their position.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about the top of the ticket, and then we'll go down the ballot. But obviously, the major changes have happened this cycle. The sitting president pulled out, and now we've got Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, running for the Democrats, and Trump running for the Republicans. How did you all think about the presidential race before Biden dropped out, and how has this change affected kind of how you and your friends are thinking about this election, if it has? Ava, you go first.
I have more hope.
Okay.
I feel like that's something I've heard a lot of people bring up. Yes, I felt at a loss and not as interested or excited as the election beforehand. But when we had our candidate switch, I think that it is a refreshing, energizing feeling to see, to have some sort of unity, and hopefully, trying to bringing people together more, and having, especially within, specific parties, and any party right now, there's just so much divide and partisanship. And so I think that was needed. We need a little confidence boost, a little vibe boost.
We'll come back to vibes in a few minutes. Preston, what about you? How's this changed your opinion of the presidential race?
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly it's brought more energy to just the race in general. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, Trump has ran the last 3 years. I mean, that's been almost 10 years of Donald Trump running. And I mean, we've known Joe Biden because he was vice president under Obama. I mean, we've known Joe Biden for a long time. And before that, I mean, Hillary Clinton, I think Kamala Harris entering the race, I guess, just brings a new fresh face that a lot of young people are interested in. As even though she was vice president, I think she's viewed a little bit less as an establishment candidate than I think some of the past Democratic candidates and Trump. I mean, say what he wants, but Trump is an establishment candidate now. If you think about it, I mean, he's been president before. He's been the leader of this party. So I think kind of taking that turn away from the establishment, I think that honestly energizes a lot of young voters just in general. I think recently there's been a surge with like kind of almost populist rhetoric, I think. And I think that honestly did start with Trump and the kind of like drain the swamp terminology and rhetoric about that. And it happens on both sides. I mean, you go far right, you get all that drain the swamp talk. You go far left, you get Bernie Sanders, who isn't exactly the most establishment candidate out there that a lot of young people are really excited about. And so I think new, fresh faces who haven't been on the political scene for a while really, really energizes younger voters.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there's some statistic about this is the first election in 20 years or 30 years that doesn't have a Clinton, a Bush, or a Obama on the ticket or whatever it is. And I think by the very fact that Kamala Harris is black and is a woman means that she's not an establishment candidate in the way that she's not like a white male as most, all but one president have been. And so, I think there's already some like history making aspect to it, which I think is always a little exciting. Although I will say I'm getting a little weary of, making history. Like there's been enough history made in my lifetime that I would like to have some slow years, no pandemics and, election fraud and attacks on the Capitol and all that.
Gosh.
So aside from the presidential race, which obviously takes a lot of the energy up, and we'll come back to it in a second because I think that's what everyone's kind of thinking about. And the two of you are maybe atypical from the median Gen Z voter that you both are like interning with a civic organization. You're both from Edmond. Like there's you're both white. Like there's some aspects of your identity that certainly shape your worldview. How, with that said, do you or do your friends, and those may be different answers, but how do you think about the rest of the ballot? Other candidates, legislature, local, anything else? Does that even factor into your, consideration whether or not to vote, and how you relate to candidates, politics, parties, all of that?
I see when I talk to my friends, surprisingly, I feel like I see a lot of, as we go down the ballot, I see a lot more open-mindedness. I think when it comes to the presidential election and just races at the top of the ticket, I think people are a lot more locked in on how they feel. But I think as you go down the ballot and you start to get these more local elections, even the governor's race, I think whenever those come around, I think people are a lot more open-minded as you go down the ballot, and Republicans aren't as scared of having a Democratic state House member, and Democrats aren't as scared of having a Republican state senator. I think we're really just locked in at the top of the ticket, but I think honestly for young people, and I think just people in general, as you go down the ballot, you get a lot more open-minded.
So like a Republican county commissioner is like less scary than a Republican president to young voters?
Absolutely. And honestly, I think as you get, obviously each situation is different, but I think when it comes to local elections, I think they tend to be a lot less, the candidates tend to be a lot less radical, and I think it tends to be the campaigns tend to be more about the actual issues and substantive policies that are being debated. And I just think when we're having those kinds of conversations about the policies and the issues, and we're really being open-minded, I think it's easier for people to accept a candidate that it doesn't have the same exact party on their headline.
That's interesting. I don't know that I agree, but I hope that you're right. It is interesting. I think your postulate that younger voters are less partisan is backed up by data, right? Like both anecdotal data from us doing voter registration, where the vast majority of young voters register as independent, and from our experience, and that trend seems to be playing out across the country.
Absolutely.
And when you do some polling, younger voters tend to skew left a little bit, but there is a growing skepticism or maybe even disdain for political parties, where young voters are like, these things don't represent me, right? Like Nancy Pelosi is not an institution for younger generations the way that maybe she is for even millennials. I guess I'm an elder millennial or Gen X, where she's been around for like our whole life in a different kind of way. And I think this also is an interesting election because we have the first few Gen Z people like getting elected. Sometimes it's down ballot,
We
which
have a lot younger candidates. on the
changes some
ballot.
energy, yeah. I know there's some younger folks running even for congressional races around the
Oh,
country.
yeah.
Obviously, there's hardships they face in terms of name recognition and fundraising capacity and all of that stuff. But often there is also an energy about it
Oh, yeah.
that's hard for the older candidates to compete with.
You have to start somewhere. I mean, that is where change is rooted in, is the passing of time. And, we're going from generation to another and hopefully trying to have people that represent us a little bit better.
That's the goal.
I definitely agree with Preston's point for sure. I think that the main aspect of it, at least taking a few steps farther back, is just the fact that young people are so uneducated down ballot in local elections. And so I feel like definitely focusing efforts on making sure like they understand what these office holders do. Like, nobody my age knows what a county commissioner is, and so
We've referenced that twice now on this episode. Our listeners better be tuned in.
so it's just definitely, I try to focus on education and having conversations and trying to open people up more if they aren't, because that is something at least our age group needs to go into these next couple of years with as we mature more and get farther into adulthood, is we need to, get some government literacy and make sure that we understand that, how their decisions will affect our livelihoods and what their office positions do. Like, it's just basic education that we need to understand.
Yeah.
Our education system has failed us quite a bit because I didn't know what a county commissioner was when I was in high school.
That's a whole separate conversation that I think is difficult. There's a lot of stuff we learn in school that we just forget too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that, because you don't think it's useful when you're 14 and then you get to be like,
you're like, I'm never going to use
40
this when I
and you're like,
graduate.
right. And you're like, oh, snap. It's a big deal. And I mean, since we're talking about county commissioners, just this morning, Oklahoma County Commissioner Carrie Bloomert represents I forget what district, but the middle of the county, Oklahoma City proper, most of Oklahoma City and downtown, that area, announced that she is stepping down and accepting a new position as the head of the Mental Health Association. Commissioner Bloomert, I'm sure, has been on the show. In fact, maybe on her first election. I remember doing an interview with her, but I think a friend of the pod, and we wish her the best in her new role. And
Yay,
this will trigger a special election for that position, I assume in February, which is when like the city council elections are. And so certainly more information on that as we get closer. But listeners, if you have ever considered running for county commissioner, you live in the middle of Oklahoma County, now maybe your chance. Start thinking about it. And I mean, the other implications too, right? Like when one position comes open, then other people who are in other elected offices might consider running, and that then opens up other seats, and there's this like trickle down effect of one resignation that can really shake things up a bit, which is interesting and a little exciting.
Throws a little funk into the dynamic.
That's right. And we all like a little bit of funk. I wish I had some good funk music. This is the closest I have here. It's not really funk, it's reggae, but we'll go with that. All right. So back to the presidential election, a couple of data points, because today is the first debate, not the first debate of the cycle. We had that, and it resulted in Joe Biden exiting the race. And I say that and chuckle because a lot of the pundits, including I'm a big fan of 538 and of Nate Silver, who recently departed 538. And one of the things they've always said is, debates don't really matter. Because statistically, a good performance in a debate or a bad performance might result in like a temporary bump or drip or bump or dump. I don't know what it is. Anyway, temporarily affect polls for like a week or two, but then they usually revert back to the prevailing trend. Yeah. However, the fact that, a bad debate performance led to Biden dropping out of the race flies in the face of that, saying, okay, well, sometimes a debate can be a big deal. 538 this week they have an episode out about debates and do they matter, and I think the title of the episode is Debates Do Matter. They talk a little bit about the debate in 1984 for president between Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale, and the first one Reagan really tanked, did a bad job, and his polling numbers dropped by 8%, I think, after that, which is a huge drop. Now, he was way ahead, and so they dropped, and he was then only ahead by like 11%, which is still, by today's standards, an enormous margin. And then his next debate, he really brought it home, where he delivered his one of the most famous lines from a debate, where they ask about age, because he was much older, and he said, he's like, I will not allow... I forget the exact phrasing, but like I won't exploit my opponent's youth and inexperience. I won't make age an issue in this, which was a really well delivered line, and even I think elicited a chuckle from Mondale, who then just got pummeled. I think Reagan won 49 out of 50 states, so a big slide there. Yeah. Anyway, with tonight's debate coming up, we are kind of co-hosting or help promoting one of the many debate watch parties are happening tonight. Tonight we're partnering up with the Delta Sigma Theta alumni sorority here in Oklahoma County. But for you all, Ava, I think you're coming tonight. Preston may have other plans, but are you planning to watch the debate at all?
Oh, 100%.
Okay.
I'll be there no matter what.
What are you watching for exactly? Like, what will this debate tell you, if it tells you anything?
I think it'll just be interesting to see Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket campaigning for, this kind of spotlight. I don't think she's ever had before. I mean, she debated Mike Pence in 2020, but I mean, this is next level, and it's against Donald Trump, who's been doing debates since 2016 and is well known for being more than enthusiastic on the debate stage. And so I think just seeing how she competes with that, and also how she kind of differs from the strategies that Biden and Clinton used in the last two cycles. I think if you hear some of the news that's going around, she has a lot of people from those teams that are helping her in debate prep. A lot of people from Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign, which is kind of a shock to me, because I was a little bit I didn't think Hillary really did great in those debates, but maybe that's exactly the reason why they're brought in, is because to learn from those mistakes and go from there. So I am interested to see how she differs from how Democrats have debated against Trump in the past.
Yeah, interesting. Ava, what about you?
I think I will be looking out most for Kamala's responses and her level of self-control, and the way that she regulates, her responses. Because for me personally, I would find it difficult to have certain types of conversations with, I guess not even that, I don't know, just watching how she articulates herself, seeing somebody that it'll just be a little fresh to have someone that's well worded, and she's just such an amazing speaker, I feel like, on so many different things. I'm interested to see how that will show on a debate stage, instead of her just, talking by herself or doing a speech or, anything like that. So I'm hoping that, like at the DNC, she hit pretty hard on her speech. And so I'm hoping that she has that same amount of energy, and I hope that it feels the same way.
What about in your social circles? Like, are any of your friends talking about the debate? Do you think this debate has any weight or bearing on their likelihood to vote at all, or vote for a certain candidate?
Yeah, I talked to a lot of my friends, and they honestly, a lot of them will say they haven't made up their minds. They're waiting to see how the debate goes, which is really fascinating to me, because I feel like there's not a lot that we don't already know about all these different candidates. Absolutely. But I think just honestly in the modern day, I think as elections and politics has become more of a spectacle, I think debates have just mattered more and more. And I'm planning on, I know a lot of my friends are watching it tonight, and I think by the end of the night probably they'll have their mind made up about that.
So this is presumably some are poli-sci majors also, but also other majors, people who maybe don't watch as closely as you do to this kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a lot of, I have a lot of, one thing I'll say is I think a lot of my Democrat friends are very like locked in. When I talk to some of my Republican friends, not so much, if you're asking. I mean, I think that naturally happens because just young people tend to be more left-leaning. But I think with Biden, there were a lot of doubts with my Democratic friends. But now with Kamala Harris, not so much. I think there are still a lot of doubts about Trump from young Republicans my age. And I think they're not just looking to see how Kamala does in this debate. They're looking forward to seeing how Donald Trump does as well. And if he's able to kind of maintain himself, honestly, the way I think he did in that debate against Biden. If you look in 2020, I think Trump was just, constantly interrupting him and kind of making a fool out of himself. But then
rude.
If you look, and I think that's something else that I will say I'm looking forward to seeing is how the role of the muted mics play again in this one, because I think last debate with the muted mics, it honestly worked to Trump's advantage because he came off as less aggressive and wild and just overall like interrupting and bonkers because he physically. So it's interesting to see if he takes that more subtle, tame approach than he did last time when he's debating Harris.
That's interesting. I'm just impressed. I hadn't really thought about how the muted mic could help Trump. I kind of assume my initial like gut reaction is like, oh, thank God, because I don't want to. I get annoyed when people. It's part of the thing. I just don't.
And it's. Yeah,
like it, but
it's really interesting because if you go back to the original debate against Biden, Biden's team was the one that pushed for the muted mics, and in my opinion, that was part of the reason for his ultimate losing that debate. And now it almost seems like the flip side. You hear from the Harris campaign, a lot of them want the mics to be on the entire time.
Yeah, I think. Some of that probably speaks to Harris's background as a prosecutor and like. Being able to have a quick comeback that limits that, right? So like it allows a speaker, in this case Trump, right, to say something and it just to land. And even if it's just a few seconds before they allow her to rebut, there's still like a bit of a gravitas that just that silence conveys. Although we'll see, right? Like I'm very interested in how this plays out as well.
I'm also interested in policy. And more importantly, Trump's policy. I feel like a lot more people are familiar with Kamala's, and that's because she has probably voiced that a little bit better of the actual policy she would like to put in place if she does get elected into office. I have not heard much from Donald Trump, and feel like I have viewed both sides quite a lot in the past couple of weeks, and just as a viewer standpoint, that is something I will be looking for, is actual policy that has pillars to it, that things that could actually be passed by both sides of the aisle. Just hoping for the good, and we'll just see if that's what we get.
Yes, we will. I think when I think about this election, it kind of boils down to like three potential prevailing forces. One is personality of the candidates. One is the policies that they champion. And, you guys mentioned things like policies, abortion, climate change, things that voters probably care about. And then there's just like vibes, just vibes. Do you, of those three, personality, policy, or vibes, what kind of election is this for you? What do you think is which one of those is carrying the most weight right now?
Personality.
Yeah? For you? Like who the candidate is and their personality? All right.
Focused a little bit too much on personality, I guess.
So let me ask a clarifying question.
Sorry.
Do you think that the campaign itself is being defined by personality, or is that the piece that matters most to you?
I think that certain parts of their campaigns might be defined by personality, but policy is most important for me.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm glad I asked. Preston, what about you?
I'll tell you what it's not. I don't think it's policy. I will say I think it's a little bit. I think it's a mix of vibes and personality.
Yeah.
I will say I think when you hear a lot of these candidates talk, they're not really both Harris and Trump. They don't really give too many concrete policies. They kind of just talk more in general senses, which I mean it makes sense. It's a presidential election, but I mean you talk to people that are supporting Trump, and they say their main issue is the economy. And the overall vibe is from a lot of Americans that they just felt the economy was better 4 years ago than it was now. And whether the data doesn't necessarily say that. I mean, GDP is great, unemployment's down, inflation, whether we might not feel it right now, is under control. But still, most Americans feel that the economy is not doing great. And so I think just that kind of vibes and the feeling that, hey, was I better off 4 years ago, is really pushing a lot of Trump voters. I think on the opposite end, I think with Kamala Harris, I think a lot of her voters aren't even necessarily in it for the policy, but are more in it for Kamala Harris. I mean, she's got this personality. She's a prosecutor. Trump is a convicted felon. While obviously her voters are agreeing with her policies, I think a big part of, she has a lot of the same policies as Joe Biden, but look at where all this energy is coming from. It's not because of her policies have changed, it's because the energy in the person has changed. So I think, to me, I'd say it's more of a vibes personality election.
All right. Well, we are only 56 days out from the election. We're just a few hours away from the first debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Preston, Ava, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having us.
Listeners, as a reminder, aside from just watching the debate and talking to your friends, there are some things you can do to have an impact this election. And one of them is to volunteer with us, right? We have voter registration events happening a ton. Next week is National Voter Registration Day. It's National High School Voter Registration Week later this month. We're doing a big thing in the Plaza District this Friday for Live on the Plaza. We still have volunteer slots available if you want to get in on that. And then on Saturday, September 28th, whatever that last Saturday is, I think it's the 28th, is the Plaza District Festival. We'll have a booth there. We'll be there all day from like noon to 8 or 9 p.m. And we desperately need volunteers. It's a super fun day. You get to be outside. You meet lots of people. The event brings in 20 to 30,000 people from the surrounding area. It's always a really productive event from a voter registration standpoint. And I can't be at the table all day because I am hosting a civic engagement panel inside the Lyric Theater in the afternoon at 4 o'clock. So we desperately need you. Also, if you want to have a pity ask, my dad was going to be there and he died. So come be an Eddie. Volunteer with us. Show up. I'm not thankless. I'll say it. We need you. If you can't be there, your kids have soccer, you got stuff going on, you're home sick with COVID, if you can throw us a small donation even, it makes a huge difference, right? $25 goes a long way for us. We put all that money back into the work to allow us to reach more voters. The voter registration deadline for this year for the election is October 11th. So you've got just a month to get people registered, and then we're switching over hardcore into get out the vote activity. So, man, I talked longer than my music ran. That's it, folks. Have a good week.